All right, so thank you. As Leanne mentioned, I'm going to talk about improving pass rates in first year stats. I will give an overview of just our context and the motivation for this. I'll talk about some changes that we made in our teaching with this aim, and then we've done a preliminary evaluation at the moment in terms of student anxiety, student confidence and performance. So I'll talk about that evaluation. And then at the end, I'll have a summary and discussion. So that's where we're headed over the next little bit. In terms of our context, I teach together with my colleague Rupert. We both coordinate a university-wide first-year stats subject. It's fairly big, so we have 600 to 900 students per semester, and it runs in both semesters each year. So we get about 15 to 1600 students per year. And the research suggests that about 70 to 90% of students experience some level of anxiety while studying statistics. And that can impact student outcomes, which include academic performance. So this is part of the motivation for this study. In our particular subject that we teach, we have a core part of the subject, and then it's we also have streams within the subject. So depending on a student's degree that they're enrolled in, they'll be in one of two streams at the moment. They'll either be in the science and health stream, or they'll be in the data science stream. And the majority of our students will be in the science and health stream. So about 90% will be in the science and health stream. This is just you don't have to look at this in detail. I realise the writing's small. But basically, this is an overview of our content. We've got everything that you would expect in a first year intro stats subject, t-tests and hypothesis testing, confidence intervals and whatnot. The science and health students will do some study design as well as a little bit of repeated measures analysis and introduction to some big data topics. The data science students also do those same big data topics, but they'll also do some data visualization, machine learning, and a couple of other things. So that's, and the students will only do one or the other of either science and health or data science, but everybody does the core part of the subject. So that's our context. In terms of this, this study, a little bit of, well, one of the things that we found out through the study was that at least, well, about 95% of our students at the beginning of the semester experience at least some anxiety about statistics, which is a very high percentage. In terms of our pass rates over time, so the subject started in semester 1 of 2022. That was our initial starting pass rate when we began, 64%. It has been increasing over time. So by the end of last year, a year ago, we were up to about 78% pass rate. But we still felt like there was more that we could do in terms of improving pass rates. So what we looked at was introducing the amount of early assessment. We know that according to the stats anxiety literature, weekly low stakes assessments are recommended in stats anxiety literature because they can help with that relationship between stats anxiety and procrastination. So that's one thing. But apart from the stats anxiety literature, in teaching and learning literature more generally, early assessment can be recommended for additional reasons. It can help students progressively build their knowledge, especially if the earliest, if there's low stakes activities. It can help us as lecturers to identify at-risk students and then provide support and intervention strategies as well. So there's some benefits to doing early assessment. We thought we would give it a go and see what happened. So this was our assessment structure before we made any changes. We had weekly quizzes for the first 8 weeks, which were worth a combined total of 10%. In the second half of the semester, so weeks 6 to 12, we had 4 assignments which were worth 15% each. And then we had a final exam worth 30%. We changed this at the beginning of this year, and we now have 6 weekly quizzes. So we reduced the number of quizzes and we increased the amount that they were worth. We reduced the number of assignments from 4 to 3. And basically what we did there was we integrated that first assignment, which was originally due in week 6. We integrated that into the weekly quizzes between weeks 1 to 6. And then we reduced the percentage of the exam a little bit from 30 to 25%. So what did that mean? Basically what it meant was that before the change, we'd get to week 5 or 6 and students would have done about 10% worth of the assessment. After the change at that point, they would have done about 30% of the assessment. So, and similar kind of thing, if you look around week 7 point, before the change, students had done 25% of the assessment. After the change, they've done 45% of the assessment by that time. So rather than our assessments being kind of end of semester heavy, we've balanced that out a lot more. Another really big thing is that computer skills, so that initially the weekly quizzes really didn't assess any computer skills. They assessed the concepts that we were covering in lectures, but there were no computer skills assessed until assignment 1, which wasn't due until week 6. Whereas now we're getting those computer skills assessed from week 2 onwards. So what that means is that students really, for those assessments, they have to engage with the computer lab material from week 2 onwards. Before, a student could have disengaged from the computer labs until week 6. And at that point, suddenly, if they had disengaged, they'd have a lot more to catch up on than they do now. So that's what the changes mean. And then finally, we've ended up with less assessment tasks overall. Another thing which I might mention is that the weekly quizzes, students get 2 attempts each at those. They're not timed, so they have about a week to complete them, but for each attempt, there's no time limit except that they have to finish it within about a week. And the quizzes are not what you might think quizzes as, so they're not simple multiple choice questions. Some of them will have, they're fully randomized, so I've used our exams to make those. Students often will get an individualized data set. They'll have to download that, do some analysis, and then go back into Moodle and answer some questions about it. Might even need to create some plots or things like that. So that's what we've done. I probably should also mention as well that at the beginning of this year, we also changed our weekly class activities. So we have actually moved more in the direction of lectures, and we've just slightly changed the structure of our computer labs. So before, students would go to two 1-hour computer labs per week. Now we've just consolidated that into 1 2-hour lab. So it just makes the timetabling a lot simpler and more consolidated for the students. Happy to talk with anyone about those decisions afterwards, because we did think about it quite a bit. But and this is not directly part of the study, but I'm mentioning it because it could have had an effect on results that we see as well. In terms of our study design, so we ran this study in both semester 1 and semester 2 of this year, and we distributed a questionnaire to students at 3 time points within each semester: week 1, week 7, and week 12. And the questionnaire had a few demographic questions. We asked students about their stats anxiety at each time point. We used a few scales to do that. If anyone's interested in that, I can chat more with you about that. The scale was basically if students had sort of 1 for the stats anxiety questions, they were not at all anxious. If they answered a 7, they were extremely anxious. So it's a 7-point scale. We had a similar thing for confidence, but the scale went the other way around. So kind of the other way around. A 1 would be that they were not confident. A 7 would be that they were very confident. We also asked students in the second two questionnaires about their perceived impact of the early assessment, so those weekly quizzes that we were having. We asked them about their perceived impact about that on anxiety, confidence, learning, keeping up with the material, and their motivation. And so their answers for that question, a 1 would have meant that the weekly assessments had a strong negative effect on any of these things. A 7 would be a strong positive effect, and if they answered 4, then it would just be a neutral effect. We also asked the students 2 open-ended questions. In terms of the number of responses we got, these are the numbers of responses for time point 1, 2, and 3, so week 1, week 7, and week 12. We matched the responses, so in terms of students who answered all 3 questionnaires within the same semester, 30 students answered all 3 questionnaires, and that meant that we were able to track their confidence or anxiety over time. And of course, we're going to compare student performance before and after these changes as well. This is the results in terms of the anxiety. So like I said, there are a few, actually this one on the right is confidence, these 4 are anxiety, and we had a few scales. This first one here is the overall anxiety. We've got a 1 here, the bottom, a 7 on the top. So the higher we are, the more anxious students are. And we have the 3 time points. So week 1, week 7, and week 12. So not much change in terms of students' overall anxiety. This is anxiety about choosing the right test, not much change there either. But what we do see is a significant change in students' software anxiety. So, and they're becoming less anxious about using statistical software over the semester, and that was a significant change. In terms of their anxiety about asking for help, it's lower in general than the other anxieties, types of anxiety, but there was no significant change in that over the course of the semester. And same thing with confidence. So they get a little bit more confident as the semester goes on, but it was not a significant change. So the main standout here is software anxiety, which we saw a decrease. And this is some details about that. This dot point here, what I'm saying basically is that week 7 and week 12 were significantly lower than week 1 when you look at them. So week 7 was significantly lower than week 1. Week 12 was also significantly lower than week 1. Then in terms of the students' perceived impact of the weekly quizzes, in terms of how did it affect your anxiety over the course of the semester, confidence, learning, keeping up, and motivation. So the more green it is, the more positive the students were saying the effect was on that particular aspect. Red means that it's a negative effect. The yellow is neutral. So we're seeing overall for all of these aspects actually that students perceived that the weekly quizzes were having a very positive effect on all of these things. The most marked was keeping up with the material, and probably the second most would have been learning. So they perceived that it had a positive effect on those things. This is some more details about that. So keeping up with the material, remember it was a 7-point scale where the closer it is to 7, the more positive the students are saying it is. So keeping up with the material, an average of 5.78, followed by learning, which was 5.64. And they were all, we tested whether those were significantly different from 4, which is neutral, and all of them were highly significantly different from 4. So in other words, students are saying they like the weekly quizzes and it's having a positive impact on all of these things. Okay, so in terms of student performance, what was the impact? This we've already seen. We started at 64%. We were at 78% before we started this study. And these are the pass rates this year. So, and I like to compare semesters like for like, because I think students tend to do a little bit better in second semester compared with first semester. So first semester, if we look at that first, we're seeing an increase from 70% to before the changes to 81% after. And then for second semester, 78% pass rate before the changes, 84% after the changes. So there does seem to have been an obvious improvement. And then we did some thematic analysis of the open-ended questions. This was not as rigorous as what Maren was explaining earlier by any means, but it probably will be by the time we analyse our data properly. So this is a very preliminary presentation of our results. Nonetheless, so students were saying that the weekly quizzes helped them stay accountable and consistent with their learning. It helped them improve confidence. They liked having 2 attempts at each quiz. Some students experienced a fear of failing in terms of having those quizzes, which I think will tie into the stats anxiety that we were seeing. Students made comments that the quizzes helped them understand the material a bit better, so confirming that they felt that it helped with their learning. It helped them stay motivated and engaged with the content, and I think that was reflected in the improvement in pass rates as well. And part of the reason that it helped them stay motivated was because they got marks, so it contributed to their overall mark. Another one about consolidating their knowledge, so in terms of learning. And then we asked them a question about what else, apart from the weekly quizzes, helped you reduce your anxiety about studying statistics? Because, of course, our study was related to the early assessment, but we thought, well, there might have been other things that students found helpful. So they said one of the most prominent themes was support from teaching staff and tutors. So that's comes through. It doesn't really seem to matter what we're looking at. Students always find this one really, really important. The learning materials, a structured learning environment. Students talked about using additional resources, so YouTube videos, our Maths and Stats Support Centre, fidget toys. This one I thought was interesting. Other students mentioned other personal strategies like taking breaks, accepting lower performance, and binge drinking, which Microsoft Copilot made a point to let me know that that was not a healthy coping mechanism. So, but that came through in the thematic analysis that we've, preliminary thematic analysis. What's that? You'd hope, yeah, you'd hope that they make it clear. Yeah, we want to make that clear. Peer support, they talked about that. Again, having multiple attempts at the quizzes and no time limits, which really supports one of the first things that we mentioned from the literature, the stats anxiety literature. So that's not a surprising finding. They like having a relaxed and supportive classroom environment. They find that helpful. And then interactive elements within the classes, like Kahoot quizzes, which we use in lectures, and getting to engage with the content during the classes. So in terms of our summary, what did we see? Well, we saw that there were significant reductions in software anxiety. I was talking with a few people beforehand about this aspect. So we actually, in the first year that this subject ran, we used R as our software tool for all students, and we had that for a year, and then after a year we switched over to Jamovi for the science and health students. The data science students still use R. Jamovi, if you haven't heard of that before, it does actually use R in the background, but it's a really nice point and click, freely available stats software. So students really do seem to like using it, and they find it relatively easy to learn, especially compared with R, which is fully coding. So So students seem to generally enjoy using Jamovi, and I think that's the reason that we saw that decrease in software anxiety. As we saw, most students perceived that the quizzes positively impacted their anxiety, confidence, learning, keeping up with the material, and their motivation. All of that seemed to be very clear results. And we did see that student performance, the pass rates, improved significantly this year following the changes. Like I said, this is just a preliminary analysis, but we are going to do more analysis on these results. But in terms of what we can see so far, we could call these preliminary recommendations. I think, generally speaking, we can say that increasing the amount of early assessment can have a lot of positive impacts. I think one of the key things is that we're assessing important skills early on. So we're not waiting until week 6 or 7 to assess those really important skills. We're starting that at week 7. So I think probably we're catching some of those students who maybe would have been feeling anxious and procrastinated until they really had to, and then maybe getting halfway through the semester and just giving up. I think we're catching some of those students by getting them doing some more low stakes but key skills assessments early on, and they're slowly building confidence through that. Didn't talk much about this, but it may be that the introduction of having lectures was helpful as well in terms of supporting student success. I think the teaching team plays a really key role in helping students reduce anxiety. And the multiple attempts and having non-timed low stakes assessment, especially at the beginning of the semester, I think can work really well. Positive classroom environment is always going to help, and then having interactive elements is always a good thing too. So I don't think some of these things are not rocket science, but they're just good, solid teaching practices that are reinforced through the students' comments through this. I think that's about it. So I'll stop at this point and leave some time for questions.